Let's bring in Hollywood divorce attorney David Glass for more on this. David?
People going through divorces are going through some of the hardest times of their lives, and a lot of what they're going through is emotional. And in any divorce, there's a huge sense of loss, and loss of relationship, of money, some friends.
We're back for a new episode of The Hourglass, where family law and psychology intersect. As a reminder, I'm David Glass, a certified family law specialist, former psychologist, and the author of Moving On, Redesigning Your Emotional, Financial, and Social Life After Divorce. As I mentioned last show, more than 50% of all marriages end in divorce. I also mentioned that divorce is arguably one of the most difficult of all of life's major transitions. But that's why we have this show, so you can get through this transition in one piece. We have guests on each show, those who have extensive experience in their own respective fields of expertise. They share ideas that help people through each step of the divorce process. Every episode tackles a different aspect of this often grueling experience. We key in on one issue each episode. My show is designed to bring insight, clarity, and comfort to those who are about to go through divorce, those who are in the middle of one, or those who are trying to come out the other side. Same ideas I cover in my book, only with The Hourglass, we have lots of discussion. Last week, we talked about the red flags leading to divorce and the grief that goes along with the stark realization that a toxic relationship is over and when the appropriate time is to get out and sensibly deal with the divorce process. Today, we're going to talk about some of the emotional aspects of the divorce process and how not to get caught up in a time drain with all the emotional baggage. Our focus is on how a person feels about the emotional aspects of divorce and how to deal with these troublesome, often erratic feelings as you move through the stages of the divorce or breakup process. Whether you were the person calling it quits or your partner did, there's always some kind of emotional residue that's hard to shake, that keeps people from moving on. If your state of mind is constantly disrupted by an emotional roller coaster, jumping from anger to sadness, to resentment, to frustration, to remorse, to sorrow, to sadness, guilt, and longing, know that it takes a lot of energy and a lot of time. The key I found was to eliminate, mitigate, or minimize emotional triggers. Emotional triggers are often to blame for a good deal of the angst of divorce, like the reminder of the joyful holidays you once enjoyed together, or that yearly anniversary date that's coming up soon. How about Valentine's Day, or Mother's Day, or Father's Day? How about the kids' birthdays? And things. They're likely all around you. Those thing triggers could be your photo albums, memories that irritatingly pop up on your computer screen automatically with something like, your memories on such and such date from 2014. Do what you can to disable that prompt and other triggers that suddenly come out of the blue. Triggers can also be the little things around you, like that special vase you picked up on a vacation and it still sits on your coffee table, or the painting you splurged on together as a holiday gift to each other that still hangs over your half-empty bed. It could be the bottle of Moet that's still tucked away in the back of the fridge that you and your ex vowed to share after the next big promotion at work. Some things are small, other things are big, but each thing can spawn nostalgic thoughts. And they make you think. Thinking makes you feel, and feelings can run amok and creep in at any time, day or night. But how we deal with these thoughts and how we manage the feelings that accompany them is what we're going to tackle today. Keep in mind, moving on is the whole idea behind the show. As we discuss emotions and getting caught up in them, well, that's going to be our single focus. But we'll have plenty of empathy to go around, and we'll give suggestions on how to keep your feelings in check and not get stuck in them. Before we get to our first guest to talk about this subject, I'd like you to do a little introspection in the form of a pop quiz, like you did in our last episode. There's no right or wrong with any of your answers, by the way. Just allow yourself to make an honest assessment as to whether you are moving on or still stuck in the coulda, woulda, shoulda trap. They are all triggered by emotions. Examine why you are just stuck or constantly distracted by nagging feelings. Here is your list of statements. The yeses and the nos may let you know where you stand on the moving on spectrum when it comes to whether you're ruling your feelings or your feelings are ruling you. Number 1, I think about my ex all the time, part of the time or occasionally. Number 2, I'm still clinging to hope that the relationship might not be over. Number 3, it seems that everything I look at, hear, smell, or remember triggers deep feelings of sadness. Number 4, I find myself angry, depressed, or agitated constantly, sometimes or never. Number 5, I remain in a state of denial about the facts of the breakup, perhaps like the reality of the divorce filing, or the reality of your partner having moved out, or the reality of your partner now dating someone else. These things are still not real to me. Number 6, I find that I'm not interested in much of anything. The following tasks are the ones I most avoid. For example, I don't want to get out of bed in the morning. Though I'm not big on wasting time, in this instance I say you need to take a little time after the show today to answer every one of these questions. The answers bring your issues to the fore, which is the first step in learning to manage your feelings. During our last It Takes Time segment, Dr. Gretchen Kabaki was on to talk with us about grief, about working one's way through the stages of divorce, starting at the very beginning of the breakup, the realization that it's over, and working through the stages of grief just like with any other death. Today, we have a very distinguished guest, retired Judge Isabel Cohen. On the bench for years, she has seen high emotion from couples in the courtroom. She's going to offer tips on dealing with the feelings that are pretty common when going through a divorce. But before we hear from Judge Cohen, I want to introduce our next guest. Our next guest is someone who's endured a great deal of emotional duress, not because of her own breakup. She and her ex never married, but they did have a son together. In fact, if you caught our last episode, you may remember Max Fay, a 14-year-old who shared his feelings of grief at the loss he had experienced at having no relationship at all with his biological father. Now, Shawna, in a few words, can you tell me what it felt when you ended up breaking up even before your son was born?
Yeah, it was surprising and disappointing, but I really was excited to have my son. And I just tried to navigate it the best I could. I was just probably more thrilled just that I was having a child. That was my focus.
Right. And what were some of the things that you were thinking about in terms of having and raising a child that really cemented it for you that you could not live with your partner?
He became very combative once he found out that I was pregnant. He wasn't supportive at all. And I had to make some tough decisions. And I just decided that I was going to have to do this by myself. So I had to find that inner strength and surround myself with my family and let them know what was happening and just move forward and, just not really have any contact with him whatsoever.
Yeah, sometimes it's the hardest and easiest thing to do is just to make that decision, I can't be around this person anymore.
Yeah, I had a therapist that I was seeing at the time regarding this, and she was the one that actually recommended that I cut him out because of the emotional verbal abuse that was happening because he was upset that I was pregnant. And so, he didn't want me to go through with the pregnancy, and I had already made my decision that I was going to, have our child.
So at some point you decided to have the baby that became Max, and you decided not to have a relationship with Max's biological father. What did you do, or how did you do it, to learn how to try to co-parent with this person that you yourself didn't want to live with anymore?
So a mutual friend of ours had reached out to me and had told me that his biological father wanted to have a relationship with him now. So I reached out to him. I had changed my phone number and moved, so he had no way of contacting me. I did reach out to him, and we had a conversation and agreed to put the past behind us and move forward, just parenting. And so we had long conversations about that. And for a long time, it actually worked. And I thought we were doing a pretty good job.
And then how did you find you communicated best with your then co-parent? What worked for you?
For me, dealing with him, I would talk to him about things, and when he got a little combative, I would just gently talk about the things that I wanted, and then I would find a reason to leave and give him time to marinate and think about things in a more rational way instead of being defensive. And so, but we would have a lot of conversations, and we would get together for breakfast and just talk about Max and what we wanted for him. Sometimes he was agreeable, sometimes not so much.
Right. Yeah, now skipping ahead a few years, at some point, Max felt like he did not want to have a relationship with his biological father. Can you think back to that time and tell us a little bit about what was going on between you and Max.
So, Max was struggling. He was kind of talking about things almost not directly, but almost in riddles. And I didn't pick up on some of the things that he was talking about. And then I got called into the school because he had been talking about harming himself. So that's when I realized that something was wrong. And then finally, we went to therapy, and the emotional verbal abuse that was happening came to light. And his father had been adamantly against Max having therapy, even though he'd asked for it throughout the years. And I didn't do it, which is regretful now, but we finally did. And that's when I discovered what was happening. He didn't necessarily want to stop his relationship with his father, but that's what ended up happening.
Right. And so, what kind of feelings, what kind of emotions were you going through when you find out that Max has thoughts of harming himself?
I was very confused. I didn't understand where it was coming from because he had been told by his father not to tell me a lot of things. And through the year following that, I discovered a lot of things that had been happening for a while. So I just was very shocked. I was surprised. I was sad. I was upset with myself for not picking up on some of the cues that were there. And then in retrospect, it seemed clear. But at the time, I just couldn't imagine that his father would be that way with him. Yeah. And we had been co-parenting in a pretty decent way. And so I was really surprised. And I think I was in denial for a moment. And I was really saddened by what my son had been going through without my knowledge.
Yeah. Gosh, that must have been such a tough moment. But you got Max into some therapy. And that obviously helped you start learning what he was feeling inside, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it was pretty immediate. Within the first or second session that we had with his therapist, he really told us a lot. And he really felt safer to tell us more once he had decided that he wasn't going to see his father. And his therapist was very wise in asking him, how long of a break he wanted from his father. And he expressed that he wanted 90 days. Right. And then she asked him how often in 90 days would he like to see his father in therapy. And that was once a month. So I think he felt safe knowing that he could tell me these things without his dad, having any kind of retribution against him for actually coming forward and talking about these things.
Right. And so the therapy was a safe place where Max could start expressing himself and also telling you what he felt he needed.
Yes, and then talking about the abuse that was happening that had been a secret. And so he felt safe because he knew that I was going to protect him. And we had long conversations about this. And his therapist was really good in letting him know that he is safe now. And so I think that was the key, was just he knew that he didn't have to see his father for a while. And then it was sad because then he did want his father to come into therapy and he refused. Right. And that was about 2.5 years ago.
Right, and since then, does Max have any relationship with his dad?
He has no relationship with his father. We offered to have him join us in therapy to help him have a healthy relationship with his son. And I tried to be as compassionate and kind as I could during this time because I know that he suffers from a lot of childhood trauma that's unresolved. Yeah. And he suffers from narcissism. And so, a lot of narcissists don't want to go to therapy. And that was the case with this. So Max had such a loss there because he kept expecting his father to show up and get the healing and mend their relationship and move forward in a healthy way. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And until Max realized that wasn't going to happen, he was kind of stuck in a holding pattern. Once he realized his dad wasn't going to show up, that's when he began to heal.
Right. And so he had to get over the loss, he had to go through his own grieving process.
Yes, absolutely.
And on a more practical note, when you wanted to get Max some therapy, how did you go about doing it? I know that our viewers and our listeners probably are wondering about this. How do you find a good therapist?
It's very challenging. So Max had been asking to see a therapist for years. I thought it was for something else. He's gifted and he would get these big existential thoughts. So he would suffer from existential, depression and anxiety. And so I thought that's what it was about. And it wasn't. So I talked to his father about Max wanting to be in therapy, and he was adamantly against it, which in retrospect is because he was abusing and that would be discovered once Max was in therapy. And so I independently started looking for a therapist, and not very many people were taking, child psychologists were taking patients. I was just trying and trying. And then eventually Max said he didn't want therapy because I think his father had talked him out of it.
Yeah.
And then when I discovered that he had been verbally and emotionally abused and he was thinking about harming himself, that's when I reached out to somebody that I knew that was a therapist, and she agreed to take Max on as, her patient. And, I guess, and I think it's something that people should realize. I mean, if one parent is adamantly against your child going to therapy when they're asking for it, they might have something to hide.
Right.
That's,
it's hard to imagine a parent not wanting to sign on for therapy when their child is saying, I want to go to therapy, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I should have seen that, and I didn't. So, but we did eventually get him to therapy, and that's when everything changed.
Sure. And it's been that way for a lot of my clients, getting them into therapy. People figure, well, I'm just going to go and talk to someone. But you need someone who's trained and someone who has the time and bandwidth to really listen to you and then to help you on your way. And if you try to do that with a friend or an aunt or your mom, it's probably not going to work.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks so much for sharing your story with us here today. I know it's going to resonate with a lot of our viewers who might be earlier in the process, and perhaps they'll start looking at those subtle signs that maybe you missed, unfortunately, and they can bring their child into a more safe place more quickly.
I hope so.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See, once again, it can be time-consuming to process your feelings, but not until you can do that, it's going to be really hard to move on. Once again, my goal for all you viewers going through divorce is to move you through your breakup to get to the other side, so you can enjoy a productive and happy life. Often people get bogged down with negative emotions. They become conditioned responses, and they become habitual. And I mean they can be habitual for years. Next up, we have someone who's seen it and heard it all, Judge Isabel Cohen, now retired. She's thought as one of the most formidable family law judges to ever sit on the bench in Los Angeles. Lately, she's been doing alternative dispute resolution. She does mediation, she does voluntary settlement conferences, and up until a short time ago, she was doing private judging. Now, Judge Cohen, there are a certain number of cases that just can't seem to settle, that just go all the way through trial. In your many years of experience, what is it that compels people to go all the way through a very expensive trial? Is it anger? Is it sadness? Is it competitiveness? Is it just plain ego? What do you think?
It's all of the above, and expectations of family law trials, which usually are not borne out. I think the first one that pops out is revenge, because even if you win and the other side loses, it's a pretty hollow victory.
Yeah.
What happens to families who go through trials, including the preparation, depositions, discovery, is a waste of physical assets, emotional life, and truly makes children in jeopardy. Children are conflicted even more when their families are in trial. By that I mean they feel pressure to vote for the father or vote for the mother, and the toll taken on children probably will affect them for the rest of their lives. So, in a word, I would say that it is the feeling aspect and feelings that people do not let go of, which brings them to trial, and that one of the most important skills that an attorney can bring to bear on a family to help it avoid trial is to let go of the negative feelings, and even to help the parties understand, or his or her party, to understand that the rational faculty kicks out when we're possessed by feelings.
Right.
And when, in fact, you have feelings, don't do anything. Wait until they subside, because feelings are involuntary. They come and go in waves, and they will subside. Parenthetically, the good feelings will also subside, not just the bad.
Right.
And when, in fact, your feelings subside, your rational aspect kicks back in, and they can be informed by your feelings. In short, anathema is what trial is to family life and psychological life of children and adults.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll often say to my clients in a very blunt fashion, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And do you think it comes down to that for people?
It does. And I think I can also say, in the words of Martin Luther King, that war is a poor chisel for peaceful tomorrows. And there is no doubt that family law trials are war, and war is hell. I think anybody who wants to test that can speak to people who have had something other than a peaceful settlement or even a peaceful divorce. And in my opinion, every attorney should start out by selling the good divorce. It's possible in most cases. The exception might be where there is some kind of mental illness or mood or personality disorder in one or both parties. And often you find both parties. I think that most other people can be appealed to by reason, despite the fact that they march into your office filled with feelings, which they haven't let go of.
Right. I just find that the people who want to fight all the way through trial, they keep me in business. And they make things work around here at my firm. But I much more enjoy working with people who maybe come in upset, but I can talk to them about letting things go, about moving on, about, instead of looking in the rearview mirror, looking down the road a bit. Do you find, I mentioned you do a lot of mediation. Can you tell us about how mediation works in a divorce and also what the benefits of it are?
I can do that, and let me start with physical assets, which is to say that trials are really prohibitive to all but the very super rich. Upper middle class people will spend their children's higher education budgets on trial. The costs of trying the case, the preparatory discovery, the aftermath of that is really not always poverty, but certainly loss of the bulk of the family's assets. So we're talking here about cost-benefit analysis, which in the long run demonstrates very clearly that investing in settlement, even though it costs a few bucks more in spousal support or a few bucks less in equalization payment of the property, it will render the biggest return on investing your money.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that's only the physical aspect. The psychological aspect, of course, is that trial judges cannot cut the loaf in half. Only the parties can do so by voluntary agreement in settlement. And so if you go to trial and you win the trial, which you might not, there is a win-lose ending to that phase of life, which does not make for a happy tomorrow. And if you settle the case for half a loaf, everyone who gets half a loaf walks out, shall we say, unenthusiastically.
Right.
But the end product, which is that you share birthdays and bar mitzvahs and confirmations and weddings and grandchildren peaceably, you really lay a foundation for the future. I mentioned in passing that mediation is voluntary, and thus, if you do not voluntarily agree, you can, in effect, at any moment in mediation, stand up and walk out. For all the reasons I have previously explained, I think that's a bad idea.
Right.
Mainly, it will plunge you into a financial morass and a psychological morass. And your children, most especially, will be disadvantaged, extremely disadvantaged by it. So really, mediation works by a psychological form of surrender, and it is a process of letting go of feelings. It's a confidential process. Nothing in mediation which may be an offer or a concession is considered an admission for purposes of trial should the mediation fail.
Right.
And the parties go to trial. The mediation and all within it is privileged and confidential. It is, well, there are some very few exceptions to the confidentiality, one of which is any litigation required, or I should say family code required papers which must be filed with the court.
Right.
Are not privileged or confidential if used in mediation. They can be, because they must be filed with the court, they are public.
Mm-hmm.
And if the subject of attorney's fees is bifurcated, there is a provision in the family code which permits for persons who have thwarted settlement, and this is not, it does not refer to a simple failure to agree.
Right.
It refers to an irrational, and you can use any other adjective you wish, such as mean-spirited or out of the ballpark offer.
Yeah.
Behavior of one of the parties which has unjustifiably and inexcusably driven the costs, including attorney's fees, way up, and unnecessarily, I'll add that too. So, but leaving that aside, the purpose of the law is to permit people to make concessions and to make offers which they would never necessarily concede or offer in trial, and which a judge would probably not rule upon in the same fashion. Judges are not, as I said, allowed to break the loaf in half.
Right.
They must stick to the technical requirements of the law. Only the parties can agree to break the loaf in half, and the requirement for that is voluntariness. The one thing I really haven't spoken about
Sure.
in depth is the effect on the children.
Mm-hmm.
And the effect which is referred to as conflicting the children, that it has on their entire lives.
Right. So if there has to be a connection between parties who can mediate their disputes and learn that they can get along in some fashion, and the long-term effects on their kids, isn't there?
Big. And there are times, by the way, when the best outcome for the children is divorce.
Right.
For instance, if the parties have no emotional distance and they are still in the marriage, and emotional havoc reigns, and that's the order of the home and the family, that really is not good for children.
Yeah.
And it may be, if only one parent is the reason that both parents are behaving badly, very, very unlikely. Both parties probably are reacting irrationally because they, leaving aside those people who are personality disordered or mentally ill, because they are ignorant of how to resolve their disputes peacefully, and ignorant of the fact that feelings do not accurately reflect reality. They simply reflect the interior of your feelings, whereas the rational faculty perceives what reality is, and which we now know does kick out in the course of combat between the parents.
Yeah.
So, knowing all that, we also know that children who have predictable stages of development, which is a psychological truism, and those stages are expectable, generally speaking, within certain ballparks. We know now that children do not reach those milestones timely. They are impaired by failure of the parents to give them psychological security.
Yeah.
Because psychological security, which is at the very least the absence of, I called it combat because that's what it is a condition for healthy childhood development. And don't think for a moment, I would like to make one more point if it's all right.
Sure.
That children don't read the tea leaves, even if the tea leaves consist of silence, which is certainly preferable to fighting, or facial expressions or tones of voice. And don't think for a moment that the father must, let me put it the other way around, in order for children to survive divorce, and this is a skill that's necessary in a society where over 50% of families are divorcing. It used to be only, that statistic used to be only the state of California statistic, but it now applies nationally. So really the children are in psychological jail while the parents are at odds. The message is, you can't love the father. He is not love-worthy. And or from the other side, you can't love the mother. She is not love-worthy. Mind you, it's also a truism that the child's identity is born of identification with the father and identification with the mother. So the message, of course, from a mother who says your father is not love-worthy, is the child's blocking that piece of his identity from developing, and the message from the father that your mother is not love-worthy is, again, interferes with the child's identification with the mother. So what, of course, the solution is that parents in divorce must, there's no other substitute for it, act such that the father gives permission to the child to love the mother, and the mother gives permission to the child to love the father. The outcropping of children who whose development is stalled or arrested for the reasons that they are in this combat zone is that their functioning as adults is impaired. And some kids make it through as adults and some don't. I think the parents need to be risk averse.
Absolutely. I tell my clients, you don't have to be best friends with your ex-spouse, but you certainly have to act friendly, and especially in front of your children.
That is a very good way to do it. First of all, everybody understands what you just said.
Right.
And it's a generous enough way to put it so that everyone, excluding, as I did from the beginning,
Right.
people who have some mental health issues, can find that to be an attainable goal, especially if they become conversant with broad strokes of child development and child psychology. And that's not a very big leap for a parent who genuinely loves children.
Right.
I'll put it in another understandable way, harder to achieve than to say, which is that parents must put their needs and wants, or at least their wants, if not their needs, second behind the best interests of their children. They must do what's required, which is the real definition of love.
Absolutely. Now, Judge, you've touched on a lot of issues. The show's about the intersection of law and psychology, and you were the ideal judge that I thought of for this show because you weave in not just the legal requirements, but the psychology of people going through conflict and, importantly, the psychology of their children. Thanks so much for being with us here today.
It's been a pleasure, and I think what you're doing serves a very useful function in a society with divorce.
As I mentioned in my first show, the Hourglass will focus a lot on time. Time is one of life's most precious commodities. Yes, you need to process feelings, but as I mentioned, sometimes people get stuck in them. They stay in the anger mode, for example, and spend years trying to get back at their ex. Some don't always end up in a courtroom, but they do seem to wind up in mediation, year after year. Believe me, it's a waste of time. Remember that 16th century poet George Herbert, who said, "Living well is the best revenge." So if you're keeping the divorce battles waging, ask yourself why. Ask yourself, and your attorney, if perhaps there's a better way to resolve differences finally, and use your time for other things. Ask a good therapist how you can shed your emotional baggage. If you're taking notes today, as you gather your quiz assignments from today's show, write this down. Time flies. How much of it are you willing to squander on negative emotions? If you want to spend time on emotions, make sure that it is time value added. For instance, here is some fun homework. For every negative emotion you experience, I want you to experience 2 positive ones. Let's say you came upon that special vase or that birthday card you saved with that tender message from your ex when your ex wasn't your ex. Now, to get out of the slump you probably fell into, go for a run, listen to some new music, watch some humor, read an inspirational book, or watch a video that offers positive affirmations. I want you to keep this exercise going because the 2 positives will always outweigh the 1 negative. You want this practice to become habitual. The mind will begin to gravitate towards the positive way of feeling and reacting as you move forward. It will also become a way of life for you long after you get through your divorce. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not asking that you ignore your feelings. You should welcome them. They help you process the grief. I'm just asking you to ask yourself, how long do you want to do so? Wallowing can be healing so long as we don't prolong it. During our last show, I suggested you get an hourglass. This is a great time to use it. Decide how much time you want to wallow or obsess on a negative feeling. Go ahead and dwell. That's the idea. Assign it a time period, though, and when that time is up, it's time to start letting go of that feeling and start the timer for a positive one. Give it a try. You might be surprised how much control you really do have over how you feel. Remember, it's the thinking thing. If you can better manage how you think, you can get a firm grip on your feelings too. Those feelings that should have been processed long ago. All right, let's go to Time Out, the Hourglass's humor segment. A break from the heavy stuff we always cover to bring your otherwise stressed out mind back into perspective. There's nothing more healing or bonding than humor. It helps you pull back to get a better, more objective perspective of what's really going on and how you can get a healthy break from the misery. Today, we have Nate Adamsky. Nate is a stand-up comic who performs around the LA comedy scene, places like the Comedy Store and the Laugh Factory and other well-known venues. So Nate, we always like to ask our comedians a question. Today's question, well first, are you married?
Heck no.
Okay, and do you have any experience yourself with divorce?
Well, my parents are divorced, and I am a product of divorce. So yes, I do have experience with that, and I think those traumas make me a good stand-up comedian.
Excellent, excellent. Well, getting right to our question, what worries you most about going through a divorce?
I don't want to be stuck with the dog. Being stuck with the dog is probably the worst thing that can happen to a man in a divorce, honestly. If I'm getting divorced, a dog is just too much responsibility, right? And when I'm in a divorce, I'm being an irresponsible guy. That's what's going down, right? And you get stuck with all these other things too. You get the in-laws vase that you never liked. You get the cutlery that just doesn't cut anything anymore. And it just sucks. And you only use it for special holidays. And otherwise it just sits in the drawer and just takes up space. And then you find out when you're dividing all the stuff, how much stuff you have. You just have all this stuff, just everywhere, stuff. And I don't want to be stuck with all the stuff.
When I got out of my divorce, I left with my clothes and a couple of books, and I left everything else behind.
That's the way to go, man. That's the way to do it. Did you get a cool sports car?
I did. I went out and got a Porsche.
You have to. I think that's what you're supposed to do, right?
Right, I was 41 years old,
Yeah.
freshly divorced.
Porsche.
Yeah.
Is it convertible?
It was a convertible.
Of course it was a convertible. It cannot be a convertible. That's great. So you just drive down PCH and you just leave it all behind, man.
Right.
Just keep going, hair in the wind. You're lucky you still have hair in the wind. I don't have a lot of that.
A little bit. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we've covered the basics of heading for divorce and dealing with the grief and loss of the relationship. And today, we've covered some pretty substantial ground on what to do with your feelings and the to-dos for managing your emotions during this difficult life experience. We also took the time out to laugh at a few things to balance out our brain chemistry. Thanks, Nate, for that. We hope you found it helpful and comforting. Be sure to tune in for our next episode on redesigning your life after divorce. This one will address the moving on process when it comes to handling your new financial life. Bring your calculator and a notepad. We'll have another pop quiz and some excellent guests on, including one of the country's top financial advisors, Simon Singer, who will help guide you with your money decisions as you push forward in the after-divorce move-on effort. We'll also have Jeff Williams, a journalist who writes for the Wall Street Journal, U.S. News & World Report, and Forbes. He's going to let us know what media sources are best to read as you work on your finances and reorganize your money. We'll have a few other surprises too. For now, remember, if you're struggling with your emotions, take some deep breaths. I promise you'll get through it. Millions of other people have, and so will you. I'd like to leave our audience with a song to listen to, one that has a meaningful lyric about time. In 1968, one of the band members from the jazz fusion ensemble Chicago wrote a top 10 hit, Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is? The composer and main lyricist, Robert Lamb, stresses the importance of taking time to appreciate the small pleasures in life instead of rushing from one place to another against the clock. When I hear that song, I often interpret it to mean that so many are unaware of how we take time for granted. Listen and find your own interpretation. There's a recurring refrain after the main chorus. Does anybody really know what time it is? And does anybody really care about time? I think we should all care, especially when we waste it on non-productive emotions that we dwell on for far too long, and when we don't spend it on the little things that are pleasant and uplifting. Don't forget, spend your time wisely.